Serious, what is something scary that has happened to you that you cannot explain rationally? With Halloween around the corner, it's time to break out those creepy stories. Edit, loving the stories. Be sure to check the new comments too, there are some good ones buried down there. I dreamt I was being choked and woke up to find my own hands around my throat. Oh my gosh, this jogged my memory of something that I'd completely forgotten about. Woke up from an unsettling dream because my wrists were really sore. Turns out my boyfriend at the time had his hands clamped tightly around my wrists, because I had full-on tried to strangle him in his sleep, and he was trying to get me off his throat. To this day I have no memory or idea why I was strangling him. TLDR, tried to strangle past boyfriend in my sleep. When I was in uni I lived by myself. It was a nice little studio unit behind a house in a fairly decent area. I would honestly think nothing of walking places at night. There was a 24-hour McDonald's and a 7-Eleven that I would walk to, often between 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. since I was a massive night owl. Well, one day after finishing an essay at about 2 in the morning I decided I was hungry but didn't really have anything easy to cook, so I decided to walk down to the 7-Eleven and grab a pie or something. However, as soon as I opened my door I was overcome by a suffocating feeling of fear. My heart started pounding, I started shaking, the works. Telling myself that this was ridiculous, I walked out to the street with the intent to still go, but that was as far as I got. I was terrified for no reason that I could understand, but no less intensely despite that. I ran back inside and ate dry cereal. Later the next day I heard about a group of drunk guys that were causing havoc down near the intersection at the 7-Eleven. They'd beaten up someone from my uni. Even though I can't explain it, I'm convinced something bad would have happened to me that night if I had ignored that feeling and gone anyway. This is really the only type of paranormal type stuff that I believe. It seems like somehow humans are able to perceive, sense relevant situations to them when it comes to extreme emotions, situations. So often you'll hear about people experiencing extreme and seemingly random negative emotions at the same time a loved one dies unexpectedly, or other things like that. I'm not really sure what it means, but I feel like stuff like this is the last thread of hope that I have, that just maybe death isn't as boring, frightening as, well, you're just dead and that's it. Granted, I still rationally believe it's like that, but situations like this are very interesting to me, since I can't quite realize how we'd be able to sense things like this in others that we care about or situations that would be relevant to us, especially across vast distances. I'm a little late, but screw it. I was in first grade, hanging out at recess with a friend. He was shooting some hoops outside and I was playing DS, sitting on the pavement. I remember him asking me if he could make a shot from halfway across the court. I told him he could try, but he probably wouldn't make it while looking at my DS. Suddenly, my dad asks me what I mean, and when I look up I'm sitting on my living room carpet, talking to my dad, and it's dark out. I was sitting in the same position, playing the same game, same level, and same exact spot in the level. Everything continued normally that night, and I didn't tell anyone at the time, but looking back it is really freaky. I thought it was a dream for the longest time, but thinking about it, it didn't really feel like a dream, and I don't really remember dreams that well. TLDR, teleported through space and time once. Sounds like anterograde amnesia. Usually people who suffer a traumatic event have it. Using myself as an example, I used to lose time, so to speak, and started to notice that I would just appear in different rooms of my house. It could have just been a one-time thing, but if you lose time frequently you should see a doctor. Edit, anterograde, not retrograde. I once lost time. In third grade me crush gave me a hug and I didn't hug her back and she got real mad at me. We didn't talk for a few classes and after lunch I told her I was sorry I didn't hug her back. She replied that it was last week and it was okay. I staunchly detested and told her that it was only earlier that morning. I got weird looks for the rest of the day. I posted this a long time ago, but when I was younger my mom was dating this guy, who we will call JB, and after a few months he invited my mom, me, and my brother to go with him and his son, about my age, out to his lake house for the weekend. It was right on Lake Michigan but up in a more secluded area, which was pretty awesome. Well, we got up there and for one I already felt really creeped out. It was a smaller 2, maybe 3 if you count the really big attic-story house that had the living room, dining room, kitchen on the first floor and had 2 bedrooms on the second floor. His grandfather had helped to build the place with the grandfather's dad, and then he lived there for most of his life working as a tailor in the nearby town. We went up to the attic to get some beach toys because that's where JB kept all of that stuff so he didn't have to haul it every time he went out there. Well, when we went up to the attic, I noticed in the corner covered in some dust and cobwebs about 8 mannequins, some just upper torsos and some full body. Not too out of the ordinary considering a tailor had lived there. Me and JB's son slept down in the living room on the couch since there were no more beds, and near midnightish I heard on of the stairs squeak a few times. Figuring it was my mom coming to check to make sure we were asleep, I told his son to be quiet and quickly turned the TV off and hid under the covers. After not hearing any noise for a few minutes, I looked out from under the covers and saw 3 of the mannequins moving around in the kitchen. Like their body parts weren't moving, but they were sliding around the kitchen. I swore I was dreaming but was so terribly frightened I hid back under the covers with a small yelp and then heard the dragging on the floor coming closer and peeked out, seeing one of them just a few feet from the couch. I hid back under the covers and shut my eyes tight, hoping it would go away. The next morning I got up and tried not to think about it, really hoping it was just a bad dream, but when we went back up to the attic to put the beach stuff back, the mannequins were in different spots and weren't covered in cobwebs anymore. Don't believe me if you don't want to, but it happened and I've been scared shitless of mannequins ever since. Good Lord. Did JB's son hear it too? I had asked him about it the next morning, but he said he heard the sliding but he didn't know what it was since he hid under the covers right after I turned off the TV. When I was 6 years old, I had a cat named Buster. Buster was actually my stepdad's cat, but because I never had a cat before, I claimed him as my own. Suffice it to say, Buster didn't like being hugged and coddled all the time by a little child, so he hated me. He avoided me at all costs. He was also an outdoor cat, so he would often spend most days outside and then come in for the night. One night, Buster didn't come back in the house. We usually fed him at night, so I was worried. Our area was also well known for an abundance of coyotes. My parents were being a bit hush-hush about Buster's disappearance, but I didn't get the hint. That night, when I was drifting off to sleep, Buster jumped onto my bed. He lay down by my head and let me pet him until I fell asleep. Honestly, I was shocked because he had never done this before. The next morning, I triumphantly walked downstairs and related to my parents that Buster now loved me because he slept in my bed during the night. My parents looked at me inquisitively and sat me down at the breakfast table to let me know that while they were outside the night before, they had found Buster's body in the alley behind our house. They thought he had been harassed by a coyote. But he was dead, so he couldn't have slept in my bed that night. To this day, I like to think that Buster just wanted to say goodbye and thank me for trying to love him in the only way a child knew how. In my childhood home, I would often hear touch typing coming from the computer downstairs early in the mornings. I didn't think much of it at first. My parents worked from home and it wouldn't be uncommon to wake up in the morning to hear Mum typing away at the computer. One day I got up and called out to Mum, assuming she was down there working, as I could hear typing. No answer. No one was down there at all. I was sure I heard typing. This began happening regularly. I figured I was so used to hearing typing from downstairs that I was hearing things that weren't there, so I didn't mention anything to anyone, figuring I was going a bit crazy. This happened on and off over a period of 6 months. The sound of fast typing and fast, furious clicking of a mouse as if someone was frustrated. One morning I was eating my breakfast when I heard Mum at the top of the stairs call out to me, "You're not down there on that computer already?" I froze and ran out to her. I was amazed she had heard it too. She was convinced she could hear typing, yet no one was down there. I told her about all the times I'd been hearing it, and then my sister opened up about hearing it regularly too when no one was down there. I wasn't crazy after all. I set out to try catch whatever was causing it and to try discover a rational explanation for it. I'd sprint out of my bedroom, to the top of the stairs where I was able to look down into the room to see if anyone was at the computer. No such luck. Every time I got there it stopped. I think it went on for a couple of years and we learned just to kind of live with it as it wasn't every day. I was down there once when the ceiling light globe in the center of the room began flashing very fast, strobe-like. It then exploded and glass went shattering all across the room. I was lucky I ran out of the room when it started happening because I was scared. The whole mysterious typing, you know. If I hadn't ran, the first would have been hit with bits of light bulb. Around that same time I was on the computer at home by myself when something happened that resulted in me never being alone in that room again. I felt and heard this really sharp intake of breath directly behind my right shoulder near my ear. I've never ran so fast in my life and was hesitant going in that room ever again. Prior to that, the whole typing thing had just been something weird and a bit spooky, not scary. Still makes my heart race when I think about it today. Have never really encountered anything like this before or since all those events. I don't particularly believe ghosts either, but I'm open to the possibilities of something in which scientists don't have a proper explanation for yet. TLDR ghost was a proficient touch typer who had a breathing problem. Pretty sure I lived in a haunted house for a while. Strange things. For one, I always felt like I was being watched in my room, and if I had the door open to the hallway I would swear I'd see someone walk by out of the corner of my eye. We had 2 cats and they'd be in my room sleeping and then all of a sudden they would sit bolt up and stare at the door, and nothing I did could move them for a long time. This happened often. One day in my bathroom, the shelf that had my sister's beauty stuff randomly lose hold of all of the items. The thing was, the shelf wasn't loose or hanging and all the stuff had to bounce out of a 2-inch high lip into the sink. One time in the middle of the night, my sister's 100-plus-year-old dresser she got as a gift from our grandma just fell over. This thing weighed a ton and it was built like a tank. Sister said she heard the sound of someone pushing. Mom and sister used to yell at me for sneaking around the house, only I wasn't home or I was in my room. They said they saw a man in shadows that was about my height. One day we also ran into the old owner and my mom casually asked the lady if she had ever experienced anything in the house. The lady started crying and said no one believed her, but yes, she experienced a lot of stuff. I moved out around that time. I do not miss that place. Not to freak you out, but there have been stories of homeless people living in occupied houses. Most famously is the story of the woman hiding in the closet and sneaking around for food when the owners were not there. They captured her on camera. It wasn't a very large house, no basement and only a tiny attic which my dad was up in frequently. I've read the stories about the homeless woman who lived in the guy's house in Japan, but I wouldn't know where someone could squeeze into. He's in the walls, bro. I used to work doing maintenance at historic properties. There was a historic house museum I worked at when it wasn't open to the public. It was part of a whole landmark site. There was a visitors center with offices and then the house was about half a mile up a dirt road in a wooded area. Sometimes I worked with a crew, but there were a lot of times I was there alone. One winter day, when it was really cloudy and dark, I was working alone to get ready to replace some electric work on the exterior of the house. I went inside and turned off the circuit to the whole property, and I tested it. It was off. I locked the doors and went outside to work. After about an hour, I got down from my ladder and started walking around the house, and then one of the lights inside the house turned on. I started to freak out, but thought that maybe someone was playing a joke on me. I called the visitors center on my walkie-talkie, and confirmed that the only other person who was working that day was still there and hadn't left, and that all the keys to the house were present and accounted for. That's when I freaked out and ran the half-mile up to the office. I made my coworker come back with me to check out what was going on, but when we got to the house, the light was off again but the bulb was still warm. All the doors were still locked and the circuit was still off. Still gives me shivers to this day. TLDR, light turns on by itself in old house when the electricity is off, which is literally impossible and super spooky. With a job like that, you're literally asking for spooky things to happen to you. TLDR, that sinking feeling you get when you think someone unseen is watching you, isn't always wrong. Hunter, mountaineer here. It was a chilly December morning. I hiked in, pre-dawn, taking about an hour and a half to go 3 miles off the beaten trails. Got to my nest, about half an hour before sunrise and started to settle in. The wind kicked up and a fog rolled in that was thicker than milk. Within a few minutes, my visibility was 5 feet. I'm sitting tight, huddled up against the freezing wind when I start to hear twigs snapping close to me. For no apparent reason, what is normally a rapturous sound indicative of an imminently successful hunt, sent a frosty chill down my spine. I chambered around in my lever action 30-30 as quietly as I could, and lay flat on my back tucked against a fallen tree. The rustling was moving closer through the fog, but I couldn't see anything. The sun was starting to peek over the mountains to my east and visibility was starting to increase. The rustling of twigs and leaves was sporadic, sometimes directly in front of me, sometimes behind or beside me. I remember laying there, rifle across my chest, thinking to myself how silly it was to react like such a coward. I rationed with myself that bears and mountain lions are a rarity where I was, and I had likely stumbled into a herd of whitetail that had bedded down. I decided to sit up. The rustling stopped immediately. As it was fully dawn by now, I was looking through the fog for the outline of my prey, which I had assured myself was literally all around me. It wasn't. Seemingly, nothing was. By now, the fog had faded away and it was apparent to me that I was alone in those woods. I hunted all that day without seeing so much as a squirrel. Around 3 in the afternoon, after fighting the wind and an abnormally cold day, and not wanting to hike out by flashlight, I decided it was time to start back to the truck. Walking out of those woods was the most uneasy I have ever felt. Lawfully, once you make it back to the trail, you're supposed to clear the chamber of your rifle. Not that day. What is normally a stroll through the woods, I undertook with the seriousness of an animal being stalked. I would walk, then stop and listen. I never heard or saw anything during my retreat, but I could feel eyes on me. I was about 100 feet away from my truck when I rounded the last corner and saw, hanging at eye level from a tree by a noose, a stuffed bear in a blaze orange jacket. I'm a giant, broad-shouldered outdoorsman, but that one shook me something fierce. Was it like a creepy anti-hunter symbol? I don't get why someone would do that otherwise. I'd like to think it was, but I don't. We're talking about a rural mountain town of less than 3,000 where everyone hunts. If there were any type of real anti-hunter sentiment in the form of threatening messages, the local paper would surely have picked up the story. I was parked well off the main road, in my favorite spot, which is my favorite spot because of how hard it is to find, and the limb they hung the bear from was way off the ground. If they were anti-hunter, they sure went to a lot of trouble. My own speculation is occultists. I've come across some very disturbing things in those woods, and the people that would have left them there could not have been in their right minds. Care to elaborate on what else you saw in those woods that leads you to believe it was occultists? Severed, disfigured mannequin heads, a squirrel crucified to a tree, weird symbols painted on trees in the middle of nowhere. One time, a trail was lined on both sides by rocks of varying sizes that were stacked tip to tip. Not top to bottom in a pile, these things were precariously standing, balancing on their tips. Must have been 500 of them, and some of the rocks didn't look like they could have been lifted by one person. Some of the biggest ones were balancing on top of rocks that were little more than pebbles. Another time, I came into a clearing on a ridge and there were 20 to 25 of these rock stacks. They weren't haphazardly piled together, these were laid so that the sides were uniform, almost like brickwork. They were each over 7 feet long, about 5 feet tall and wide enough to lay down on. The fact that those stacks aren't near the trails, but are way the fuck up in the mountains, scares me the most. It tells me they aren't there to scare people, they're there so people wouldn't find them. They legitimately looked like sacrifice altars, and to get to them you have to cover some of the roughest terrain that I've experienced in the Appalachians. I live in a condominium and we own 2 apartments on the 7th and 8th floor. The only way to move in between them is to step out of the apartment, take the elevator or the staircase and enter the other one. One night, we ran out of ice cream upstairs and my mom told me to go get some from the downstairs freezer, so I took the keys to the 7th floor's apartment and since it was dinner time, no one was there. I walked into the pitch dark and realized that someone was sitting on the sofa, so I flipped the switch to see my dad just sitting there. It was kinda weird, but I just went to get the ice cream and asked if he had a key to lock up. No answer. I shrugged and thought, well, if he came in and locked the door behind him, he must have one, went back upstairs and my dad was sitting there eating dinner. I freaked out and asked how the heck did he get up here so fast, and everyone told me that he's been here all this time. Told them it wasn't possible cause I just saw him downstairs, but no one believed me. Now I never go down there alone. Edit, to clear up some stuff, each our apartment doors are fitted with 3 types of locks. There's a gate which has its own keyhole and lock, we put another lock in it so you have to unlock this gate twice. Then there's the door and its own lock. So you need 3 keys just to enter our house if no one is inside. I did get a good look at and it was 100% my father. He's kinda fat and has this serious looking face, so it's kinda hard to mistake him. The apartments are not accessible because not only are they not on the same floor, they aren't even located on top of each other. There's an elevator in between them and they are on different floors. So there is no way for anyone to go up or down without first meeting at the elevator or the staircase. In 1975 I was flying an Army helicopter doing night training in blackout conditions near Fort Hood, Texas. I was flying down a draw with a small seasonal creek in it which was the new paradigm, designed to mask the aircraft from Russian radar. I was at the controls, my co-pilot on the map. We were low and slow tree top to tree top. Suddenly I had the compelling sure knowledge that I must do an emergency climb, which I did, climbing almost vertically. As I pulled the guts out of the aircraft and with my nose pointed up to the stars in my chin bubble, I observed the leaves of a cottonwood tree being pressed aside by the plexiglass of my chin bubble. After a couple of seconds and now a few hundred feet above the canopy, my co-pilot and I stared at each other with wide eyes and the knowledge we barely avoided death. "How did you see that fucking tree?" he asked me. I never did tell him that I didn't, because I have never known how to explain it. I went on to fly helicopters for 37 years, accident-free, and I still can't explain what happened that night. Gotta be something you picked up on subconsciously that made you do it. Maybe you picked up on a change in the sound frequencies bouncing off the trees, maybe you saw it but didn't realize you saw it. Interesting either way.